Welcome to the Windows Divine Know2collect series. My name is Shannon Robinson, and I'm honored to serve as the president of the Colorado Dominican Vocation Foundation, a nonprofit that promotes the visual arts and philanthropy. Through these videos and our events, we hope to inspire everyone, regardless of financial means, to become a patron of the arts, and more specifically, to become a collector. And for those of you who are already collectors, on behalf of all artists, past and present, let me say thank you. For it is the collector, whether they be individuals or institutions, that makes possible the vocation of the artist. Notice that I use the word vocation, which means an urge, a summoning, a calling. Here at our foundation, we believe that being an artist is a singular and oftentimes difficult calling that must be supported by everyone because it enriches and inspires all of mankind, like this famous work by Van Gogh. As plein air painter David Rodman Johnson explained, quote, "Cherished art becomes a portal through which we may enter the universe, a glimpse, a sliver, a hint of our very own heaven. Artists are providing a personal journey to an emotional state of mind. Art is not a product, but a service," close quote. At Windows Divine, we could not agree more. The profession of the artist is a noble endeavor, for it is the artist whose work is a chronicle of human history. As Carol Strickland, noted art historian, puts it, art is a tangible record of the human mind and spirit, helping us to understand where we came from, as well as to foresee where we might be headed, close quote. And yet, for most of our society, art is considered unimportant, a luxury, a nicety to be indulged in only by the wealthy. As Dr. Feldman puts it in his book, Varieties of Visual Experience, quote, "We've been conditioned to regard art as non-essential, as the product of man's surplus energy and wealth. Moreover, we think of the fine arts as being uniquely useless, impractical, and unnecessary for meeting the fundamental requirements of organized living. Nevertheless, the visual arts have existed in one form or another throughout human history, and they appear to be thriving today," close quote. Why is this so? Why has art always existed? Why do we need art? What moves us to go see art in museums and galleries, to purchase it and bring it home? In this session, we'll examine the historic purposes of the visual arts in order to understand why art is so fundamental to our existence, why it's more than a luxury, why it's a necessity. Moreover, by understanding the different roles of art and the artist, as collectors, we'll have a better appreciation of the wide spectrum of art we view, regardless of whether we choose to acquire it. According to Dr. Feldman, visual art performs a number of important and useful functions in our lives, such as personal expression, spiritual or religious concern, physical and social functions, and aesthetic expression. So let's start with the important function of personal expression. We all know the adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words, not only because imagery is universal, but because sometimes language falls short. Sometimes it's simply inadequate to describe our emotions, whether it be of the artist, the audience, or the collector. Art acts as a powerful universal language that describes the indescribable, such as loneliness, anonymity, and isolation, depicted in Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, or anxiety and depression as seen in Edvard Munch's The Scream, or maternal love as depicted by American Impressionist Mary Cassatt in The Young Mother. Art also serves as a powerful vehicle for religious or spiritual expression. This famous work by Michelangelo conveys not only the overt religious message, but the human emotions of unspeakable grief and sorrow. This is a work by Thomas Cole, who was the founder of the famous Hudson River School, which romanticized the vast unexplored landscape of the American continent and elevated the genre of landscape to religious expression. As explained by Carol Strickland, just as writers of that time, like Thoreau and Emerson, were preaching that God inhabited nature, for the Hudson River School, quote, communing with nature was a religious experience. As we all know, Van Gogh painted many famous paintings that ranged from flowers to still lifes to self-portraits to landscapes and figures, such as The Sower, the work you see here. And even though his later works, for which he's best known, did not focus on explicitly religious subject matter, his vivid and symbolic imagery was nonetheless spiritual. Through his use of intense color and expressive brushwork, Van Gogh made everything look alive. He saw the divine spirit in all creation. But Feldman contends that spiritual art and religious art are not the same. While spiritual art is obviously broader by definition, he suggests that the purpose is different as well. That religious art seeks to tell a, quote, sacred story, or enjoins right behavior, or endeavors to sustain faith. But spiritual art endeavors to be a revelation of the divine in human nature and in the world. Van Gogh himself recognized the importance of the spiritual element when he wrote, quote, "Art, although produced by man's hands, is something not created by hands alone, but something which wells up from a deeper source out of our soul. My sympathies in the literary as well as in the artistic field are drawn strongly to those artists in whom I see most the working of the soul." And even when modern art became abstract and rejected the notion of portraying subjects or invoking narratives, particularly religious ones, the notion of spirituality was not abandoned. Notably, Kandinsky, often considered the father of abstract art, in his groundbreaking treatise on the spiritual in art, contended that spirituality was not limited to the arena of representational art, that abstraction could be equally spiritual. As for the distinction between religious and spiritual expression in art history, Dr. Feldman contends that while there's no doubt that art has served as a vehicle for religious expression and devotion for centuries, as you see in the work on the left, the term spiritual art, explored by artists like Kandinsky on the right, is a modern phenomenon that arose out of the crisis of faith following the 18th century industrial, scientific, and political revolutions which questioned the nature and purpose of man and his relation to the divine. As Feldman notes, spiritual art expresses the questions an artist may have about man's place in the universe, whereas religious art tends to deal with the answers which have been institutionally established. And while people of faith may conclude that religious and spiritual art are often one and the same, such that the distinction is meaningless, for others it may be inapplicable. As for its possible impact on art, Feldman further concludes that, quote, "Since spiritual concern in our time is expressed through questioning, uncertainty, and restlessness, it's not surprising that motion and agitation should be characteristic of some contemporary works, such as we see in this famous work by Italian futurist Baccione." Sarah Thornton, in her book 7 Days of the Art World, notes that some art world observers have gone further to contend that contemporary art is a new religion. Quote, "For many art world insiders and art aficionados of other kind, concept-driven art, such as we see here, is a kind of existential channel through which they bring meaning to their lives. It demands leaps of faith, but it rewards the believer with a sense of consequence. Moreover, just as churches and other ritualistic places serve a social function, so art events generate a sense of community around shared interests," close quote. Some art also performs physical functions, such as containment, whether it's a beautiful utilitarian object such as these ancient vessels we see here, or a building that is architecturally significant, like the New York Guggenheim, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. Art throughout the ages has also performed a number of social functions. When art is created to influence group thinking, it has a social function. Art becomes didactic when used as a teaching tool to promote certain beliefs, values, and conduct. Examples include explicitly religious art, such as you see here. Notably in the Judeo-Christian traditions and many other religions throughout history, art was used to instruct the faithful. Artists have also used their canvases and other media to promote civic and moral virtues, social order, and nationalism. For example, in America during the Revolutionary War and the post-war years, artists such as John Trumbull, who you see here, would use their canvases to participate in the birth of a new nation by creating works that would reinforce democratic principles and moral virtues. Trumbull was a great painter of historical works that were designed to inspire American nationalism. This work by Hogarth in the 18th century, ridiculing the British aristocracy and the nouveau riche, is a prime example of satirical art. And of course, we're all familiar with advertising art that's designed to influence the purchasing behaviors of consumers. Finally, one of art's most historical social functions is what is known as social protest art, which was and remains an important vehicle for social change. From the 19th century onward, many artists concluded that it was not sufficient to please their audiences with their art or affirm the existing social order or the government. That as artists, they had a social or artistic responsibility to protest war, violence, human suffering, and a nearly endless number of institutional and societal wrongs, with the hope that their works would move audiences and effect change that would improve the human condition. In this famous work by Goya, the artist was protesting the slaughter of 5,000 Spanish civilians during the French invasion of Spain in the early 1800s. In this work, Riss was protesting the poverty of coal miners. This famous and terrifying depiction of the bombing of the civilians in the Basque town of Guernica by Franco's forces was a social protest by Picasso that was exhibited around the world and became an anti-war symbol that influenced many generations of artists. Indeed, from the 20th century onward, the art world would experience an avalanche of social protest art that would ebb and flow with the intensity of political and social unrest. Finally, one of the most important functions of art that has evolved and changed over the centuries, and whose definition is the subject of great debate, is aesthetic expression and/or aesthetic pleasure, whether it be by the artist or the collector. As the French poet Max Jacob advised, quote, "The moment you cheat for the sake of beauty, you know you're an artist," close quote. Indeed, aesthetic expression is often referred to as the art of the beautiful, such as the magnificent wing victory shown here and sculpted centuries ago. Aristotle and Plato believed that the study of beauty would lead to truth and the common good. Today, aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that considers the nature of beauty, art, and taste. As Michael Gormley, former editor of American Artist magazine, who now writes for Portraits, Inc., explained so eloquently, quote, "Art that is good and beautiful fills one's being. It aims to offer a sense of containment by mirroring back a universal imagining of perfection, that spark in all of us that is divine," close quote. And that belief that art was about beauty was one that prevailed throughout much of art history. Even when 19th century movements of Impressionism and Realism found artists depicting subjects that were not necessarily beautiful, like the byproducts of modernity, such as alienation and poverty, beauty was still embraced in the face of suffering. Indeed, beauty and redemption were often expressed and found even in the ugly, such as this work by Degas, that referenced the societal problems of prostitution and alcohol addiction that were rampant in Paris at the time. But the 20th century ushered in a new age of modernism that challenged much of the classical principles and methodologies of art creation to de-emphasize beauty, skill, representation, and narrative. Instead, for modernists and postmodernists, the shift focused to the formal elements of art and the originality and innovation of the concept, methods, and medium. But that shift away from explicit or even implicit references to beauty did not mean that art no longer produced aesthetic pleasure for the viewer. For example, in this popular work by famed cubist George Braque, we see a still life with what appears at first to be a chaotic jumble of shapes, but upon closer inspection, reveals a combination of recognizable ordinary objects, such as the knife, the fruit, the book, the pipe, the mandolin, the sheet music, and an etude. As an aside, Braque played the accordion, violin, and flute, which is why musical references were common in his still lifes. But what is interesting in this work, and what provokes our visual delight and aesthetic pleasure, is how he's violated our pictorial conventions about the flat surface of a table and how objects reside there. We're at once confounded and amused by his use of converging lines in the wall behind the table to suggest a three-dimensionality that is belied, though, by his two-dimensional flattening of the objects on the table that seem to rise up the full height of the walls. By defying reality and the viewer's expectations, Braques succeeded in creating a picture that intrigues and pleases the viewer. Indeed, this work illustrates the changes both in the role of the artist and the goals of the artist that typifies many of the differences between modern art and the movements that preceded it. As explained by Feldman, quote, "Once the logic of reducing images is abandoned, the possibilities are infinite. The painter becomes a kind of intuitive investigator of the shapes and colors and textures which singly or in combination are somehow appealing. His artistic conscience does not permit him to exploit the literary associations one has with objects. Any satisfaction one takes in the work must derive from pictorial organization and painterly technique," close quote. Indeed, the 20th century would affirm and expand on the radical 19th century doctrine known as art for art's sake, which explicitly rejected the notion that art had to serve a utilitarian, moral, or didactic purpose. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe and artists like Whistler contended that art had its own intrinsic value and reason for existence, and did not need to be justified by social function or other societal purposes. When Whistler, who was considered one of the most controversial artists of the 19th century, exhibited this work, called Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, at the Grosvenor Gallery in London, the public was outraged. The famous English art critic of the Victorian era, John Ruskin, likened it to, quote, "flinging a pot of pint in the public's face." Whistler sued for libel. During the trial, he maintained that a design exists in and of itself, not to describe a subject, tell a story, or trigger certain emotions. In his book published in 1890, Whistler wrote, quote, "Art should be independent of all claptrap, should stand alone and appeal to the artistic sense of eye or ear without confounding this with emotions entirely foreign to it," close quote. Art for art's sake became the new mantra for many artists who contended that art did not need a purpose or meaning. This radical rallying cry ushered in a new kind of artistic freedom, whereby the artist would be free of academic tradition and public expectations and could focus on personal aesthetic expression. And while some artists would still portray the beautiful like this, combining representational imagery with new techniques, as we see in this work by Gustav Klimt, many artists in the 20th century would adopt what the art world considered, quote, "pure aesthetic expression," which meant that art, both its creation and its evaluation, would focus on the form itself, rather than resorting to external factors such as social context, history, and artist's intent. Advocates of 20th century modernism embraced what was known as formalism, which emphasized the visual qualities of the work and how it's made, rather than its narrative content or relationship to the visible world. With respect to painting, that meant that the work would be evaluated based on its intrinsic formal qualities alone. That is to say, whether the artist had effectively arranged its formal elements, such as line, value, color, and texture, to produce a visually interesting design, such as we see here in the work of Charles Demuth of the Precisionist movement. Simply put, formalism contends that the value of the work is a function of its beauty, and beauty is measured by how aesthetically pleasing the form is, without reference to sources outside the work itself like politics and narrative. To ensure purity, the formalist emphasizes structural elements and artistic technique. As formalist Clive Bell put it, quote, "To appreciate a work of art, we need bring with us nothing from life, no knowledge of its ideas and affairs, no familiarity with its emotions. We need bring with us nothing but a sense of form and color and a knowledge of three-dimensional space." While modernists like Matisse and Picasso would elevate our appreciation of formal elements, like color, as we see here in the famous Joy of Life, and shape, as we see here in Picasso's Three Musicians, their works still remain representational in that their compositions contain recognizable objects. Other modernists, like Pierre Mondrian, would go a step further by eliminating all evidence of representational subjects in their work. The epitome of formalism, Mondrian emphasized precise geometric lines and primary colors, as you see here. Mondrian has an important place in art history as a proponent of abstract art, which rejected the depiction of what they considered distracting objects that implicitly carried meaning and sometimes purpose. By the 50s, his style was so recognizable, it became a symbol of modern art. While abstraction eliminated art's traditional reference to recognizable subjects, it did not eliminate, though, the artist's attention to craftsmanship, since skill remained critical to any successful investigation of art's formal elements, like color, which reached new heights in the superbly sublime color field paintings of Mark Rothko, which you see here. Moreover, for many, these works were no less spiritual, as evidenced by the fact that renowned collectors, Monique and John de Menil, commissioned and dedicated to the public in 1971 what is known as the Rothko Chapel in Houston, which you see here. Designed as a sacred space for meditation and contemplation by people of all faiths, the chapel also represents a call to action in its support of human rights and social justice. And while the notion of aesthetics and what constitutes the art of the beautiful can be wide-ranging, as we've just seen, perplexing sometimes and even controversial, particularly in academia and amongst art critics, as layman collectors, it's fair to say that regardless of the subject, the style, or the purpose, when the artist creates aesthetically pleasing works that stimulate our minds and hearts, the artist is doing much more than creating a mere consumer good that some might consider a luxury. Art of whatever kind occupies a unique plane that fulfills our most basic intellectual and emotional human needs for identity, self-actualization, and community. In short, we have a need to surround ourselves with the beautiful in all its forms, to remind us of our humanity and what is good. And towards that end, at Windows to Divine, we want to inspire all peoples to not only view and appreciate art in all its splendor, but also to make art a priority in their lives by going beyond the role of spectator to collector. The reasons and rewards of collecting are many, and they're the subject of our next presentation, Why Collect Art? I hope you'll join me in video 2 and all our videos covering a wide range of topics of interest to both artists and collectors. You can find the list and topics in our website at www.windowstodivine.org under our resources section. Please also be sure to read the many great books and articles we cite in our bibliographies at the end of each video. Since our purpose is to provide you a very basic and short introduction to many fascinating topics related to art and collecting, we'd urge you to deepen your connoisseurship by reading the works of the authors listed there, because they are the experts, and given our time limitations, we can't possibly cover all their important insights. So please join me for video 2 and more as we continue our wonderful collecting journey.